China has been pushing its companies, including Huawei, to build things a little more domestically and be less reliant on software and operating systems such as Android and Windows. And that's why Harmony OS Next was born. But before I get into what Harmony OS Next is, I want to give a little background on its previous predecessor, Harmony OS. Harmony OS was initially built on top of AOSP, which is just stock Android, and the Linux kernel. Just like every other Android phone, it was just another variant of Android. However, with tightening restrictions and sanctions on the technologies that Chinese companies can utilize, this basically left a hole in the market, which Huawei stepped up to fill in with Harmony OS and make it completely domestically and free of Android and the Linux kernel. But the issue I see with Harmony OS Next is in its proprietary construction. And yes, while there are examples of successful proprietary operating systems such as literally anything Apple produces in Microsoft Windows, there are some key differences on how Huawei plans to distribute Harmony OS Next, in the future at least, and how Apple distributes literally any of their operating systems, and how Microsoft distributes Microsoft Windows. For instance, Windows has historically and currently struggled to expand the architectures it runs on. While they have introduced ARM support into Windows, not all applications on Windows have an ARM version, which is where their Prism compatibility or translation or emulation layer, I don't know which, comes in, where it basically converts the x86 or x86-64 system calls into ARM system calls that the ARM CPU can understand for those x86 applications to allow them to run on the ARM CPU. The issue with Prism, though, is that not all applications work, as Linus demonstrated in this stream here where he tried games that the audience wanted to see tested. And the result of that stream is only about half of the games tested actually worked, or worked in a well enough capacity to be played. And yes, while these are games, they are still applications at their core, and don't think for a second that there aren't other applications that people need to work that also won't launch at all. And that's not even factoring in the various settings removals, the added bloatware, and the fact that Microsoft seems content on recalling times where it shit the bed. And okay, that's just for Windows. Apple, for instance, has moved between architectures, such as when they moved from PowerPC to x86 and x86 to ARM. So what's the difference here? Well, the difference is Apple's operating system is only designed for the hardware that Apple ships, which means anything outside of what Apple ships will either have issues or just not even boot at all. And a good example of this are Hackintoshes, which is macOS that is running on anything that Apple does not directly sell. And this brings me back to Huawei and Harmony OS Next, where Huawei also makes the hardware that runs on it, but in the future they also plan to not be the only maker of the hardware that runs on it. In fact, the way I understand it is Harmony OS is intended to be open to other companies to install on their devices to sell as well, whether it be phones, tablets, or PCs. So what we basically have here is a proprietary operating system, which is in the future supposed to support a lot of form factors, but probably also various architectures and devices outside Huawei's control. And that's the problem. Harmony OS Next being proprietary limits the ability of other companies making hardware to run it from contributing fixes or new features. And while the kernel is a microkernel, meaning that the companies will be able to make their own drivers for the OS, which would mitigate a lot of the device compatibility issues for the kernel specifically. However, the whole OS is proprietary, which means that if an issue arises somewhere else in the experience, they won't be able to go write a patch to fix it. They'll have to wait for Huawei to do so instead. And the same goes for new features as well. Now, if we compare this to Linux, which is basically the other extreme, where you have an open source monolithic kernel, meaning all the drivers are in the kernel itself, so you don't need to go and install them, unless you're NVIDIA or some other third-party vendor who insists on doing things outside the kernel. Thanks, NVIDIA. Anyway, Linux is just a kernel and not an operating system. Every Linux operating system you see uses the kernel at its core and builds an OS around it, which is where Linux's main problem occurs. The sheer amount of choices for installing a Linux-based OS. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't think there's a good way for me to showcase this massive graphic. I'll try my best. Maybe I'll scroll it through half the screen here so you can see just the sheer amount of choices you have. But the point here is that there are over 900 options to choose from, just from what you can see on this graphic here. And this graphic is still missing some pretty heavy hitters, such as SteamOS and anything based off of SteamOS. And maybe that was Huawei's intention with making Harmony OS Next proprietary. Maybe they only wanted one experience and not over 900, which can easily overwhelm somebody who's looking at changing their operating system. And one day, if this channel gets big enough, I plan on taking suggestions from you all for operating systems to check out so you don't have to, whether it be from this 900 plus list or not. Since I am a Linux user and I originally came from Windows, I figured I could at least help people out who don't necessarily want to give up their current workflows but are curious on what Linux is like. But this also extends to applications you want to see tested on various operating systems as well, just so you can get a sense for what works and what you'll need to change and what you'll need to find alternatives for if you are considering switching. And as for Harmony OS Next, that doesn't mean it won't be successful, but to me it seems more like a missed opportunity to have a more open ecosystem where companies can come in and build out Harmony OS Next a lot quicker at breakneck speed. And honestly, it would be interesting to check out one day, but Harmony OS Next, due to its limited CPU compatibility, won't be something I can just go and install on my laptop. So if I'm going to check it out one day, I'll probably have to find a way to smuggle a Harmony OS Next device out of China and into the US.